Welcome to a true spiritual adventure story like the world has never known with your host, Dr. James Yogati Weldon. Good day, this is Dr. Jim Weldon speaking to you from Heavenly Mountain in Boone, North Carolina. Our amazing community here, which is dedicated to bridging the gap between the different spiritual traditions of the world and sharing an outline of the stages of the growth of consciousness. This is part of my ongoing series from my third book, surprising title, The Story Behind the Greatest Story Ever Told, Memories from the Life of Jesus. And in this part of the story about the unknown life of Jesus and about how he was trained and traveled and spent many years, the vast majority of his life, in the East. There have been many rumors about this and different details that have been shared over the years by researchers seeking to uncover why there are many correlations between some of the early teachings of the Christians and the traditions of India. And in this book, which has come from a state of superconsciousness, which I'm experiencing almost on a daily basis here without my control, I'm seeing and walking through the episodes and scenes from the life of Jesus and how he was trained. And at this point in his life, he has traveled to India, spent over 12 years in a school in the southern part of India in an area called Chennai, where his spiritual teacher, Raja Rishi, has supported him. He's completed that education, and now he's decided to make the trek up north as a pilgrimage to some of the holiest sites in that part of the world. And so he's arrived now in an area known as Kashi or Varanasi or Banaras now, sometimes called the city of the dead, but also the city of the traditions of Buddhism, where it grew up. This is actually very near where Buddha gained his enlightenment, where the first schools emerged. And at this point in the spiritual history of India, Buddhism is actually reaching out to all parts of the subcontinent, but specifically in this region, because very nearby are some of the towns where Buddha spent a large portion of his life, taught, founded his community, his Sangha. And so the young adept, Jesus, is now in that region. And on the way, he's had some difficulties. It's taken him some time. One of the biggest difficulties is that he slipped and fell and broke his leg and had a gash on the other ankle. And he's now in a recuperation center, you would say, a health center. Benares is known as the city where many individuals have come because of its holy sites for ages, going back thousands and thousands of years, but also for its healing centers, but also right nearby are on the rivers, the cremation grounds. And the place that he is at right now, where he is recuperating and healing, is right next to that same area. But he's beginning to be able to move now a little bit more. You know, it isn't like it is today that you could just go into a hospital if you hurt yourself and a cast could be put on your leg. It was very dangerous to have a broken limb or a fractured limb like this. And he did have a splint, a wooden splint that was created that bound that leg, that right leg that was damaged. And as he sits out on the verandas in the open air, very nearby are the temples, the centers of spiritual learning, but also the cremation grounds. And so he's reflecting on his life and really the impermanence of life. And there has been a tradition here for seekers of knowledge to come to this area, to sit and observe this, maybe even to spend some time watching the cremations go on day and night, and also to bathe in the holy waters here and to consider the impermanence of life, which is, of course, one of the fundamental teachings of Buddha. Very nearby is a holy center that was developed then called Saranath. And there have been a number of names for that. Named after certain rishis that have been there and teachers. And it's a very, very holy place, or at that time, Kushinagar. And this town is where the Buddha left his mortal body. And it's also the place where he taught as well and traveled, all in that region. Supposedly, this particular place is where the Lord Buddha gave his first talk, and also nearby where he passed away as well. He gave his first speech there after attaining enlightenment at Bodhi Gaya. It's only about 10 kilometers from Varanasi, not that far away. And the satellite town and all that region is dotted with monasteries today. And actually those quarters and sites date back to the 3rd century BC, so 300 years. It's said that the Emperor Ashoka constructed these incredible stupas, these holy sites, and also some of the monasteries, and there are still engraved pillars there from those times. And those relics are sprinkled across the town. And if you get a chance to travel to this region, it's certainly something to see and be in the space. Nearby, Banaras, Uttar Pradesh is often described as the cradle of Buddhism. And it draws seekers of knowledge, not only from this tradition, many different traditions, the Indian traditions, from really all over the world today, where Buddha gave his first sermon and shared his last breath. And it's said that Buddha's orientation in his teachings were unique in the Indian tradition. Certainly they were. And actually the teachings attracted Jesus for specific reasons. You see, he had spent now some 15 years in the country, and he loved the country and culture, but there were some aspects of the culture that he didn't always approve of. One is what he felt was the hold of some of the priests, performing many of the different ceremonies in the spiritual center, thinking that too much of this drew away from the journey, the inner journey, to the silence within. And also, he was bothered by certain parts of the population that weren't treated as well. The Sudras, the lowest castes, if you will. And individuals had a tendency to get stuck in these particular roles for generations, locked into the land. Remember, India was not one homogeneous country. It was a land of princely states. And of course, monarchs, benign and not so benign, were throughout the country. And when Buddha came to teach, some 400 to 500 years earlier, first began to share his insights, he decided that he wasn't going to talk about the philosophy really at all at that time. He wasn't going to argue about what were the levels of creation, what were the realms of creation, what were the subtle beings that may or may not exist on those levels? How do you approach those? How do you invoke their presence? In fact, he didn't talk about God really much at all. Of course, this came later as the tradition began to deify the Buddha and other teachers that advanced in that spiritual tradition. So there was no arguments that were made. In fact, I was told by my teacher that his teachings, what he was offering, came with a very simple proposition. And that was, come and see. His teaching was, come and see. Come into the community, the Sangha, sit with the Buddha in silence and meditation, and experience the depth of emptiness within. Quiet the mind and feel the presence. And of course, men with busy minds needed to take time away to do that. So long periods of silence and meditation, and then certain acts that were designed to bring down, if you will, some of the obstacles of the ego. And at the time that Buddha came, the culture was very high, was very wealthy. Still was at this time when the young Jesus arrived some centuries later. But one of the things that he did to his early disciples is he would make them get rid of their fancy clothes, don very simple clothing, and take a bowl and have to go out and beg for their food. So imagine some of the leaders of our society today driving by in their Rolls Royces and limousines and living in their posh houses with so many, quote, responsibilities, so many things that they're doing that appear to be important, but ultimately in the scheme of things don't really matter. I can assure you that in my case, I remember quite a bit of my past histories. And I share that in my first two books, Living the Enlightened Life, and the second one, The Rise of the First World Teacher, the really global phenomenon that's happening now in the world. They're great teachers, many of them, that are coming out in the world. But in my case, the teacher that I have been with the longest seems to be preeminent in the world. Anyway, getting back to the story. So this approach of simplicity, of poverty to a certain extent, appealed to Jesus, very much so. And so he had determined, and was actually forced initially at this time, because he couldn't travel around a lot because of his healing that he was going through, to listen and hear some of the teachings. He was already attracted. And of course, there was a reason for it that he was already attracted. The inner spirit knew. He had a past history here. He had some past lives earlier. And from my insight, actually was part of the early community hundreds of years ago when Buddha was present, possibly connected to his family. And so the inner spirit had drawn him here to be in this place, which every quarter spirituality is expressed. There was a lot of support for pilgrims that came in. Every day, hundreds, if not thousands of individuals would come newly to this area. And there was a way of supporting them. Fortunately, Jesus had the means of support, and he also had his friend who had traveled with him on this journey, Abatao, who now during this period of his life was to shortly return to his homeland after many, many years, after this part of his journey was completed. Because he was told by his teacher in the Chennai region, he was told by his teacher, who actually is the real force behind all of this. The head of that princely state, his spiritual teacher, had sent him to help and guide the child in his early education. And then he in turn had made sure that the growing saintly being Jesus was moved on to his second place of learning. Second place of learning. So there are many, many correlations, many things from this culture and this tradition of Buddhism that Jesus took back. And part of the lesson of this time of his life, really these next 10 years or so, is to be a little bit more careful with his words. Because in the same way in the future, when he travels back to what is now the land of Israel in his homeland, of course he gets in difficulties and conflicts because of his words. A circumstances arise later. So for the young Master Jesus, this of course is another amazing, amazing time. A time of simplicity, because he was taken up and accepted into one of these monasteries in this area where Buddha lived. And like the other Buddhist students, was sent out with his bowl to survive and be given his meals. Not every day. So there was a period of retreat that would go on, where some of the knowledge was taught, and many, many, many hours sitting in solitude and silence in that community. Prayers and offerings in the morning from a very, very early hour, many hours of meditation. And those of you that have really undergone extensive periods like this, and there are very few that really have, it's not easy facing one's inner obstacles, restlessness of the mind, irritation, trapped blocks in the physiology, if you will, also. I know that from personal experience. I had an extensive period actually of 9 months at one point. Virtually unlimited meditation, just to go for food and to go back, and literally spent so much time sitting during that time in my life in the 70s that I literally wore through holes in my pants and my underwear underneath just from sitting. And so in a certain sense, this was the time for the young master to really begin to do the hard work. Now, fortunately, in these days, in this age, it's not so difficult. It's not so hard. We don't have to all abandon our homes and our families, and it's much easier because the spiritual traditions in the world now and this time have come to the world. It isn't required that one leave everything and go. Even by spending, a few weekends a year, tremendous progress can be made in our spiritual development. That's part of what we're doing here on the mountain here, and creating this unbelievable community here. And so, in my mind, some of the greatest authentic teachings in the world, what we're creating here on Heavenly Mountain, ultimately will be like Rishikesh, a place where one can bathe, really be baptized in the Spirit, and then provide a bridge and understanding. And the reason I'm writing these works is to help provide that bridge and understanding, to really tell the true story of the life of Jesus and the wonderful time that he spent there. And so that is the ongoing adventure that he's living during this 12-year period of his life, the third 12-year period of his life, because our life is in cycles and actually is connected to this major cycle of the largest planet. Difficult times, hard times. So he passed through one of those very, very difficult times that can come. And so the attraction to Buddhism is because of the simplicity. Although he studied these teachings of the noble truths of Buddha and some of the writings that, of course, by this time, even after that continued, because there was more significant records of the teachings of Buddha that, of course, were expanded on in the different centers that were focused. There are many, many of these centers, and their doors were open for individuals to come in and join, and they provided support, places to sleep, safe places for aspiring students. And the young Master Jesus was one of these, amongst many, many. And he was completely free to come and go anywhere, anytime, wherever the Spirit drew him to go. And so, of course, he was beginning to feel very, very sensitive to this kind of inner drive to move and go spontaneously, to be completely free and trust in the divine Spirit to take care of his needs. And so this was his time. And we should all have times in our lives like this. Not as extensive, not required. But if people do want to come and spend extended periods of time, we do have many facilities here that will support individuals very reasonably, very easily, if they'd like to participate. So in our next episode, we'll talk about some of the meetings that took place, I think. You know, all of this is coming from this superconscious state, really beyond my conscious mind. Early in the morning, I start walking through these scenes. I walk through these towns and cities, really in a 3D experience. So join us again. This is Dr. Jim Weldon speaking to you from Heavenly Mountain in Boone, North Carolina, community dedicated to bridging our understanding, uniting the differences, because honestly, all the great teachers in this world, even though they may teach in different ways, different means, the essential core of the experience of the oneness between oneself and the universe is absolutely the same. There can only be one oneness. There can't be many different ones. There can be different experiences and descriptions of that oneness and methodologies of enhancing it and coming to that experience. So it's, 75% grace and love, perhaps 25% practice. And then, of course, good karma helps. This means a past which has been useful to the world. Because what happens is when we contribute to assisting, helping others in the world, relief that they experience comes back to us in the form of our unseen wealth. There's many kinds of wealth. Money is the most transient. And of course, we've all seen now that individuals can have billions of dollars and be very, very poor. So that's one form of wealth. Second form of wealth is actually the merit that we've gained, and we gain through our activities by making a difference, really making it a difference, offering something to raise the life of those, to help those individuals around us. And of course, the that ultimately opens the doors to the beginning of the inner experience, the journey, the unknown secret journey. And that gives rise to a growing depth of our inner being, and it takes its time. It's like the growing of a mighty oak tree. It can take a number of decades. There are a few individuals that come in with that attainment already there and fall into that high consciousness. I'm actually going to meet one here in a few days. A saint who just all of a sudden, out of the blue, just fell into samadhi for many hours, and then another period actually for a number of days. Very interesting. It wasn't what I went through. I came to that, but through a number of years of work. I think so I could tell this story as well. So we'll talk to you again. Come back and listen for more. To you all.